The U.S. military is out there destroying suspected drug vessels and seizing these massive oil tankers near Venezuela.
And it's all happening because the war on narcotics has been completely redefined. It's now being framed as a necessary war on foreign terrorist organizations.
Welcome to the Deep Dive.
Today, we are unpacking the sources that detail this really rapid, high-stakes escalation between the United States and Venezuela happening right now in late 2025.
Yeah, and this isn't just, a political disagreement. We're talking about active military conflict in international waters.
And it's all backed by a very potent, and I think it's fair to say controversial, new legal framework.
So our mission today is to deliver the key facts, the justifications we're hearing from the administration, and the critical global context around these, aggressive actions.
We're looking at the U.S. argument that this is about stopping narco-terrorism and enforcing sanctions.
Right, versus the Venezuelan counterclaim, which is that this is just piracy and imperialist aggression.
And for you listening, the key insight here, the thing that's buried in this whole confrontation, is the legal precedent being set.
Okay, what do you mean?
The U.S. is using its own domestic law, this protective principle, to justify destroying vessels anywhere in the world. So the core question we have to get into is, does this new authority actually protect America from, drug poison?
Or does it just dangerously erode international maritime law?
Exactly. And does it create a precedent that rivals like Russia and China could turn around and use against us?
All right, let's unpack this. The urgency really hit home today, December 10th, 2025, with one very decisive action.
Today, tensions just exploded. There was a swift and, by all accounts, successful seizure of a large oil tanker called the Skipper.
And it was right off the coast of Venezuela. This was a complex major military operation.
Oh, absolutely.
It involved 2 specialized military helicopters, U.S. Marines, and the Coast Guard's elite maritime security and response team. These are basically the Coast Guard Special Forces.
Yeah. And the whole thing was launched from the USS Gerald R. Ford Carrier Strike Group. That's not a small detail. That's projecting maximum force.
For sure. The justification came immediately, right from the top.
Yep. Attorney General Pam Bondi and President Trump confirmed the seizure. They stated the vessel was carrying sanctioned oil from Venezuela and Iran.
But more importantly, they said it was part of an illicit shipping network that was actively supporting designated foreign terrorist organizations.
And they named them specifically: the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC, and Hezbollah.
But, this one seizure, it's really the culmination of a campaign that started much earlier in the year.
That's right. The real shift happened when President Trump signed those executive orders, the ones that designated major criminal cartels as foreign terrorist organizations.
We're talking about groups like Sinaloa and that huge Venezuelan prison gang, Tren de Aragua, or TDA.
Right. And the Department of Justice is arguing that the Venezuelan regime under Nicolás Maduro is actively using these groups to, and I'm quoting here, flood the U.S. with deadly narcotics and violence.
They even just designated another one, the Venezuela-based Cartel of the Suns, as an FTO.
So since September, the U.S. military has been launching lethal strikes on these alleged drug vessels, all under the justification of protecting the homeland from drug poison.
And we saw the Pentagon confirm that first strike resulted in 11 alleged narco-terrorists killed.
And then President Trump announced the destruction of that large drug-carrying submarine.
Yeah, claiming that single action prevented thousands of American deaths. So this is a very clear, very decisive campaign. It's about enforcing U.S. law and protecting the country.
That brings us to our first deep dive segment, redefining the threat. What we've seen is the U.S. moving from, standard drug interdiction
And something much more aggressive.
to what the administration is calling a necessary war on narco-terrorism.
The change in legal thinking is really the whole story here. The critical moment came right at the start of the year, January 21st.
That's when President Trump signed those sweeping executive orders, formally classifying criminal cartels as FTOs.
And that move just changed the entire legal ballgame.
It really did. It gave the U.S. military and law enforcement a set of tools that before were really only reserved for groups like ISIS or al-Qaeda.
And that designation, that's what allowed the U.S. to tie this whole conflict directly to Caracas, right?
Directly. The DOJ is explicitly accusing Maduro's regime of using these FTOs, including the Cartel of the Suns, which was officially designated on November 24th, to traffic fentanyl and violence into the U.S.
So they're presenting this as a kind of organized state-level attack on American security.
And American public health. And to drive that point home, just look at the pressure they're putting on Maduro himself.
The reward.
The sources confirm the reward for his arrest was doubled to a historic $50 million.
$50 million. For context, that is way more than the U.S. offers for some of the world's most wanted terrorists.
It shows you just how seriously the administration says it views this threat coming from Venezuela.
Of course, Caracas is calling this an illegal act of interference.
Naturally, they're not buying the narco-terrorism narrative at all.
Which sets up this fundamental narrative battle. You have the U.S. side, championed by figures like Secretary of State Marco Rubio, saying this is purely about national security.
Right, stopping the flow of deadly drugs, countering FTOs that poison American streets. Rubio was quoted saying the days of narco-terrorists flooding America with poison were over.
And then you have the Venezuelan counter-narrative, which just dismisses all that. They say this is entirely about seizing their natural wealth.
Their oil and energy.
Exactly. They claim the U.S. is just fabricating a new eternal war to steal their assets, and for them, the seized oil is, well, it's their proof.
Proof that the U.S. is acting like an imperialist pirate.
So that shift in legal theory was followed almost immediately by action. Let's get into segment 2. Law enforcement on the high seas. What did this actually look like on the water?
It was startlingly fast. Once those FTO designations were in place, the U.S. deployed warships, even a nuclear-powered submarine, to the Southern Caribbean.
Which Maduro immediately called reviving gunboat diplomacy.
He did, but Washington didn't back down at all.
Then came the kinetic strikes.
The military force. September 2nd was the first publicly acknowledged lethal strike on a vessel in international waters. The U.S. said it was linked to TDA terrorists.
And President Trump himself confirmed 11 narco-terrorists were eliminated in that first strike.
And that wasn't a one-off. The campaign intensified through September and October. We have at least 3 more documented strikes, all targeting vessels carrying what the Pentagon called illicit narcotics bound for the United States.
And the scale of the threat and the U.S. response was really illustrated when President Trump announced the destruction of that submarine.
A large drug-carrying submarine.
That action was huge. Do the sources give us any sense of how the military distinguishes between, say, a regular drug smuggler and an actual narco-terrorist who warrants lethal force?
The sources really emphasized that the targets were confirmed to be linked to the designated FTOs. That's the key.
So under the new executive orders, they're legitimate military targets.
Correct. And the destruction of the submarine was hailed as a major win, with the administration claiming it was loaded with fentanyl and prevented, quote, thousands of American deaths. The risk is high, but they see the threat to the homeland as being even higher.
Which brings us back to today's action, the Skipper. This wasn't a small speedboat. This was a massive oil tanker.
And that's where the narrative gets a little more complicated.
It does. The U.S. justification for this military-style seizure was sanctions enforcement, specifically connecting it to FTO financing.
Right. Attorney General Pam Bondi stated very clearly that the vessel was transporting sanctioned oil from both Venezuela and Iran and was tied to illicit shipping that supports terrorist groups.
So the oil was the funding mechanism for the terror.
That's the argument.
Okay, but wait. If the main justification is stopping FTO financing, and then President Trump is asked what happens to the millions of dollars of oil on board,
His response was, well, we keep it, I guess.
doesn't that statement just play right into Venezuela's hands? Doesn't that confirm their narrative that this is about the oil, not terrorism?
It certainly provides ammunition for that claim. Venezuela immediately called it a shameless robbery and an act of international piracy.
They're sticking to their line that this is always about their natural wealth, oil, and energy.
And the administration's response to that is basically that seizing the asset is part of the enforcement. It cuts off the financial network.
So it achieves both goals at the same time: sanctions, compliance, and counterterrorism.
That's the U.S. position.
Okay, so we've seen the motive and the action. Now for the legal foundation. How does the U.S. legally justify destroying foreign flag vessels and seizing tankers in international waters? I mean, without violating every major international treaty.
And that's segment 3, the legal underpinnings. This is where we get into the real deep dive.
Right.
The core rationale lies in U.S. domestic law and specifically the protective principle.
Okay, break that down for us.
Think of it this way. The U.S. is saying that since these drug and terror operations directly threaten Americans back home, by funding terror and flooding our streets with fentanyl.
It doesn't matter where on earth that threat comes from.
Exactly. We have the right to neutralize it at its source.
So the location is irrelevant if the crime itself targets the U.S. That sounds incredibly powerful. What specific laws are they using to make that work?
They're leaning on two core statutes. First is what you could call the High Seas Seizure Act. It's formerly 14 U.S.C.A. Section 522.
And that gives the Coast Guard the power.
It explicitly gives the Coast Guard the power to conduct inspections, searches, seizures, and arrests upon the high seas for violations of U.S. law.
Okay, so that's the Coast Guard's mandate. What's the other piece?
The second is the Federal Crime of Terrorism Statute, 18 U.S.C. Section 2332b. This is the one that grants specific extraterritorial jurisdiction for federal crimes of terrorism.
So because the cartels are now FTOs?
Any of their related financial or drug activities anywhere in the world now falls under this U.S. jurisdiction. And U.S. courts have already said the government has remarkable latitude to justify this kind of protective action.
So the U.S. is basically asserting we're using our own anti-terrorism laws to defend ourselves anywhere, regardless of where the vessel is flagged.
Precisely. But this domestic self-defense approach is causing significant international friction. Legal experts around the world are saying these U.S. actions are straining the boundaries of traditionally accepted state behavior.
Because traditionally, the rules of the sea, things like the 1958 Convention, are super clear.
Very clear.
You can't just seize a foreign-flagged vessel on the high seas without the flag state's permission. There are a few exceptions, like piracy or the slave trade.
And Venezuela is arguing that since the U.S. isn't seizing actual pirates, the U.S. is committing piracy by breaching that customary law.
And that's the big risk here for the whole world order.
It is. The U.S. is operating under the conviction that it's countering an existential threat. But critics worry that breaching this customary law creates negative long-term outcomes by degrading international legal norms.
Because if the U.S. sets the precedent that domestic law trumps the global laws of the sea,
what stops China from seizing vessels in the South China Sea? Or Russia from seizing tankers in the Arctic, all under their own claims of domestic law enforcement?
that potential blowback,
Yeah.
that's the highest stake here. And we should note, this has faced some domestic dissent.
It has. Senator Rand Paul voiced opposition to what he called summarily executing people that are suspected of a crime. And there was that failed Senate vote that would have required congressional approval.
But despite that political noise, the overall mission seems to have strong domestic backing, at least on the drug front.
It does. Public opinion polls showed 53% of Americans approved of using military force against drug trafficking vessels. The sources suggest people understand the need to stop the poison at the source.
Even if they disagree on military action inside Venezuela, which 70% still oppose.
Right.
What a dramatic, fast-moving conflict. Let's try to bring this all together for you and summarize the core takeaways.
Okay. The core conflict is really a clash of two powerful opposing viewpoints. You have the United States, through executive action and this protective principle, leveraging its massive domestic authority to wage war on narcotics and terrorism wherever it finds them.
And specifically targeting the Maduro regime's financial and drug networks.
Then you have Venezuela, which sees this entirely as a pretext. They're calling it imperialist piracy, aimed at seizing their national wealth, their oil.
One side sees protection of the homeland, the other side sees brazen theft.
And what really stands out in the sources is the effectiveness of the U.S. action. The destruction of that submarine, the seizure of the skipper.
These are concrete facts.
They directly disrupt the flow of deadly narcotics and the illicit sanctioned oil that funds FTOs. The strategic goal of disrupting those chains is demonstrably being met.
So what does this all mean for the future, for global commerce and freedom of the seas?
Well, the U.S. has successfully taken out a drug sub and seized a major oil tanker, and they've done it by prioritizing this powerful domestic principle over traditional international maritime treaties.
And this forces us to confront a huge decision.
It does. If the U.S. continues asserting the right to interdict any vessel involved in activities it deems criminal or linked to terror, how much stability on the high seas are we willing to trade for immediate security at home?
Because if we insist our domestic law justifies military action anywhere,
Are we giving a green light to every global rival from Beijing to Moscow to do the exact same thing to our commercial shipping, just under the guise of enforcing their own domestic laws?
that is the real consequence of this new, necessary assertiveness that you will have to watch unfold.